Okay, so you really weren't getting around with this suggestion, huh? Freedom, the End of the Human Condition
Huh?
by Jeremy Griffith. This one seems right up your alley, getting to the bottom of what makes us, well, us. The good, the bad, all of it.
It's a doozy for sure.
Griffith certainly doesn't pull any punches. He claims to have actually solved the puzzle, the human condition. Even calls it the end of the human condition, which is a pretty bold statement. And what's interesting is he's actually updated the book a bunch of times, even as recently as this year, 2024. What do you make of an author who's constantly going back and revising their own work like that?
It kind of makes you think, right? It makes you think that it's someone who's really trying to constantly refine their own understanding. You don't see that often with these big sweeping theories, especially ones that are claiming to have answers.
That's for sure. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with Griffith's work, the basic idea is that humans are, at their core, good. But we've got this, this thing, this sense of being flawed and selfish holding us back. He calls this the human condition, like we're all walking around with this invisible guilt trip.
Yeah, and it's not just a simple guilt trip from like our upbringing or society or any of that. He's saying it's like hardwired, like biologically a part of us from millions of years of evolution.
Okay, hold on. Hardwired. How do you even begin to explain something that's as complex as human behavior with just, biology? What about free will? All of our experience.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. So Griffith, he paints this picture of our journey from our ape ancestors to modern humans. And it wasn't all, sunshine and rainbows. He actually points to this pre-conscious state, sort of like a Garden of Eden, where we were just blissfully unaware of our, I guess, perceived flaws.
So, we were just these happy-go-lucky bonobos, totally oblivious to the existential dread of being human.
Exactly. But then, according to Griffith, something major happened. We developed a conscious mind. And with that self-awareness came the realization that, well, maybe we're not so perfect after all.
That's kind of like Plato's cave allegory, right? We see these shadows of ourselves and mistake them for the real deal.
Spot on. Griffith would say that this new awareness was so unsettling that we basically went into this collective state of, denial. He calls it resignation. We learned to deny our true nature, hide it from ourselves, from each other. It's like we all signed this cosmic NDA agreeing to never talk about our flaws.
Okay, I get it, kind of. But it also seems a little, simple, doesn't it? I mean, history is full of examples of people confronting their flaws, right?
Yep.
Both as individuals and as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big criticism that Griffith gets, that he oversimplifies things. But here's the thing. He actually anticipates that criticism. He even has a name for it, the death effect. He's saying that humans, we have this really deep resistance to facing the truth about our flaws.
So it's not that he's wrong, it's just that we're too deaf to really hear it.
Exactly. He says it's like a survival mechanism. For a long, long time, it was just too much to handle to face our flaws head on. So we evolved this deafness as a way to cope. But what if that deafness is actually what's holding us back? What if understanding these flaws is the key to, actually reaching our full potential?
Okay, you've got me thinking. So we've got this human condition, this resignation, this death effect. It seems like Griffith is really setting the stage for something, radical.
Oh, absolutely. And this is really just scratching the surface. He goes on to use biology, psychology, philosophy, you name it, to explain how this human condition shows up in every part of our lives. Our relationships, how we raise our kids, our political systems, even our relationship with the planet.
This love indoctrination thing.
Yeah.
It's almost like this biological push towards cooperation, right? I'm picturing our early ancestors cuddling, sharing berries instead of fighting over territory.
Yeah.
That's a pretty different take on the whole survival of the fittest idea, wouldn't you say?
Totally. And this is where Griffith's ideas line up with some really interesting research on bonobos. Those primates that are our closest relatives, they're practically the poster children for love indoctrination. They're known for being super peaceful, social, and having, shall we say, creative ways of resolving conflicts.
So instead of fighting, it's more like make love, not war. I guess that's one way to settle a disagreement. But are bonobos really a good model for how early humans were? They're definitely fascinating, but they're not human.
That's a very fair point. And a lot of anthropologists would say that directly comparing us to bonobos is, a bit of a stretch. But Griffith uses them as an example of how love indoctrination can actually play out in a species. He's suggesting that our own ancestors might have gone through something similar, something that paved the way for our capacity for empathy, cooperation, even altruism.
Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of argument, that this whole love indoctrination theory holds water. Where does that leave us now? Are we just stuck doomed to forever struggle with this human condition, this feeling of being flawed, even if it's not really our fault. So we left off with this idea of love indoctrination really being this powerful force in our early ancestors, maybe even explaining how humans became so cooperative. But where do we go from there? Are we just saying that humans are just a bunch of, like, love-deprived apes missing those simple days in the jungle?
Well, not exactly. Remember, Griffith says this love indoctrination was just the first step. The conscious mind, yeah, it led to the human condition, but it also gave us some pretty amazing things, right? I mean, language, art, technology, even just thinking about our own existence.
Okay, so it's like this cosmic trade-off. We gained self-awareness, but we lost that sort of, I don't know, primal innocence.
Right. Griffith actually lays out these different stages of human evolution. He compares them to the stages of a person's life, which I think is really interesting. Like, just as a kid goes through adolescence and eventually becomes an adult, humanity has gone through these periods of growth, rebellion, and hopefully some kind of maturity.
I like that. So following that analogy, where would Griffith say we are now in this whole timeline of human evolution? Are we like angsty teenagers trying to figure ourselves out? Or are we more like grumpy old folks stuck in our ways?
Well, if you ask Griffith, he'd probably say we're somewhere in between. Maybe like late adolescence with all that potential, but also this tendency towards, self-destruction. He seems to think we're at a crossroads, dealing with the consequences of our actions and having to make some pretty big decisions about the future.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's still hope that we can, get our act together.
According to Griffith, definitely. He actually thinks understanding our past, especially the whole love indoctrination thing and how the human condition came about, is like essential for moving forward. He'd say that it's only by really confronting our flaws that we can move past them.
That makes sense, but it's also easier said than done, right? How do you actually get over this ingrained resignation, this death effect? It's almost like he's saying we're hardwired to avoid looking at our own flaws.
It's a huge challenge for sure. And Griffith, he doesn't pretend to have some, easy answers. There's no magic pill or 10-step program to overcome the human condition. Instead, he's offering a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding ourselves.
So it's more about shifting your perspective than just checking things off a to-do list.
Right. He calls it the transformed life force way of living. It's about aligning our conscious selves with those ancient love indoctrinated instincts that he thinks are still deep down inside us.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What does this transformed life force actually look like in our lives? Are we talking about meditating in the woods, hanging out with bonobos, or is there something more concrete we can take away?
It's definitely not about ditching our lives and running off to the jungle, that's for sure. Griffith thinks the transformed life force, it can show up in every area of our lives. Our relationships, how we raise our kids, our work, even, like you said, our political systems.
That's quite the range. So like in our personal lives, say our relationships, how does this transformed life force thing actually play out?
Griffith's idea is that if we can understand the biological reasons behind why we act the way we do, we can have more compassionate, fulfilling relationships. Like if we realize that our need for intimacy, for connection, comes from millions of years of love indoctrination, it might help us connect with our partners with more empathy, more understanding.
So instead of blaming our partner for not meeting our needs, we should be thanking our ape ancestors for giving us those needs in the first place.
In a way, yeah, it's about shifting away from blame and moving towards curiosity and compassion. If we get that a lot of our emotional reactions, they come from our evolutionary past, we can start to untangle those patterns and hopefully create healthier relationships.
That makes a lot of sense. What about parenting? Does Griffith have any thoughts on how to, I don't know, raise more transformed life force kids?
He talks a lot about how important it is to make sure kids have a supportive environment, one that really encourages their natural empathy, their capacity for love. He'd say that those early experiences are crucial for how we develop emotionally and socially. Griffith's belief is that by giving kids that secure and loving foundation, we're helping them become compassionate, well-adjusted adults.
It's a cool idea. Like we can tap into those ancient nurturing instincts even now. It's almost like he's saying we can choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, even when things get tough. But he gets into some pretty heavy topics too, right? Like politics. How does transformed life force work in something as, well, messy as politics?
Yeah, Griffith definitely doesn't shy away from the big issues. He says a lot of the conflict, the division we see in politics, it comes from this collective resignation, that inability to confront our own flaws and, the flaws of our leaders. He thinks a transformed life force way of doing politics would focus on cooperation, compassion, genuinely caring about the well-being of everyone.
That's definitely different from how things are now. But realistically, can we actually create a system like that? I mean, politics is usually more about power struggles and self-interest than, like, compassion and cooperation.
It's a tall order, no doubt. And Griffith, he gets that. He knows it'd take a huge shift in our values, both individually and as a society. But he also really believes it's the only way to create a future that's actually sustainable and fulfilling for everyone.
So it's not just about our personal lives. It's about rethinking how we function as a whole society.
Exactly. He says the systems we have now, they're just not sustainable, not socially, not environmentally. He thinks this transformed life force way of living is a path to something more equitable, more compassionate, and ultimately more fulfilling for all of us.
Okay, so we've covered relationships, parenting, even politics. But there's another big piece of this human condition that Griffith tackles.
Yeah.
How we relate to nature. Where does that fit into all of this? So we've talked about how Jeremy Griffith thinks understanding this human condition can really change everything, from how we have relationships to how we run our societies. But then he spends a big chunk of the book on how we relate to nature. What's his take on that? Are we just messing that up too?
It's deeper than just messing it up. Griffith thinks that how disconnected we are from nature is both a symptom of the human condition and a way to actually heal it. Think about it. That urge we have to grab up all the resources, to control everything, it all comes from that same fear and insecurity that drives all our other messed up behaviors.
So we're taking all our inner drama and dumping it on nature, treating the planet like we treat each other, always competing, wanting to be on top.
Exactly. And it's not just hurting the environment, we're hurting ourselves too. Griffith says we evolved to be deeply connected to nature, that our own well-being is tied to how healthy the planet is. When we mess with the environment, we mess with our own minds, our sense of belonging.
I can see that. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone feels that sense of peace when you're out in nature, right? It's like you
Uh,
hit the reset button on all the craziness of life.
Exactly. Griffith would say those feelings aren't just some nice accident. They're like echoes from our past. They remind us of how much we need that connection to the natural world. But he doesn't just want us to sit around longing for some lost paradise. He thinks we can actually get that connection back. That reconnecting with nature is a huge part of fixing the human condition.
Okay, so it's not just about like hugging trees and composting, although those are good things. It's more about changing how we see ourselves in the whole picture of nature.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we're not separate from nature. We are nature. How well we're doing is completely tied to how well the planet's doing. And that, Griffin says, can be incredibly freeing. We can let go of the guilt and shame from our mistakes and act with more compassion for ourselves and the world around us.
It's a powerful idea, right? That by making peace with nature, we make peace with ourselves. But it also seems pretty overwhelming with all the environmental problems we've got.
Yeah.
Does Griffith give us any practical advice? How do we actually make that change, both on a personal level and as a whole society?
He does. He says, start simple. Just spend more time in nature. Let yourself feel that awe and wonder. And of course, support those sustainable practices, both in your own life and with your votes. But at the end of the day, he says, the biggest change has to come from within. It's a shift in thinking, moving away from wanting to dominate and control everything and moving towards respect, giving back, and really appreciating the natural world.
Sounds like he's talking about a kind of spiritual awakening, like recognizing how connected we are to all living things.
You got it. And he says this awakening isn't just a possibility, it's necessary if we want to survive as a species.
So where does that leave us? We've gone through Griffith's whole analysis of the human condition, his love indoctrination idea, and this whole transformed life force way of living. That's a lot to take in. What are your final thoughts?
Griffith's work, it's definitely ambitious, thought-provoking, maybe even a little controversial. He's not afraid to make bold claims, and not all of them are going to totally convince everyone. But even if you don't agree with everything he says, he gives us a really useful way to think about what it means to be human. He makes us confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, our flaws, our fears, our potential for both amazing love and awful destruction. And in doing that, he opens a door to hope, to the possibility of change, both personally and for all of us.
He definitely gave us a lot to think about. This deep dive has taken us from the very beginning of humanity to what a transformed life force future could look like. We talked about why we have flaws, the power of both love and this resignation, and how deeply we're affected by our relationship with nature. Whether you agree with everything Griffith says or you still have questions, there's no denying his main message is powerful. Understanding our past, especially those love-indoctrinated roots, is the key to a more compassionate, more fulfilling future. So what really stuck with you about Griffith's ideas? What left you wondering? We want to hear from you. Let us know what you think and keep those conversations going. Until next time, keep questioning.